So next, I would like to invite Solomon Assefa to come and join us. He is the Vice President of IBM Research in Africa and Emerging Market Solutions. And we're going to talk about some of the work that they have been doing. So Solomon, come up and join me. So I think we have a short video, a very short video to play. No video? Yes, video. Here it is.
We are announcing this week a really important alliance, and that's Allied Against Cancer. We're bringing together 5 organizations: the American Cancer Society, IBM, the Clinton Health Access Initiative, the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, and the African Cancer Coalition, which really consists of most of the oncologists practicing in sub-Saharan Africa. Together, we've recognized that we have an urgent problem that needs to be tackled, and that's improving access to high-quality care for everyone developing cancer in Africa. The key to this success of this alliance has been the recognition on the part of the leaders and the champions from each of these key partners that we have to act and act now, because the incidence of cancer is increasing in Africa, and too many people were developing this disease with no hope of getting access to treatment, let alone the high-quality treatment that we know is so critical. So together, we're tackling the issue of purchasing of affordable drugs, developing predictive tools for governments as to what drugs need to be purchased. We're developing cancer-harmonized guidelines that are fit the continent of Africa, led by the NCCN and our African Cancer Coalition and the American Cancer Society. And then we're also working on the infrastructure in the hospitals in Africa to safely handle drugs, be able to treat patients effectively in a safe and affordable way. The most vital aspect of this coalition is a commitment to keep working together and to overcome the obstacles that we see.
That was Richard Wender, from the American Cancer Society, and he was announcing this partnership that IBM is a part of. So tell us a little bit more about it. What's innovative here? What's the role that technology plays? What's IBM doing in it?
Sure. Yeah. So the journey actually started about 3 to 4 years ago, where the American Cancer Society looked at the state of cancer across the African continent. And the statistics are quite shocking. We're talking about over 800,000 new cancer cases happening on an annual basis. And if you look at the 5-year survival rates, also in some of the African countries, it's down to 10%, while in the US it's above 80% or so. So the numbers are very, very dramatic. And also, if you look at the facilities that exist around the continent, they're not that good. So the American Cancer Society initially started by saying, what can we do in terms of creating the right type of partnerships to reduce the price of drugs? So they brought in a couple of the pharmaceuticals and the government officials and so forth, and they were able to strike deals to reduce the price of the drugs significantly. And at that time, also, then the partnership started to evolve. We started thinking about, with the American Cancer Society, what's the role of some of these tools that could be used to amplify the effectiveness of the doctors. If you look at the doctor-to-patient ratio, it's about 1 doctor to 100,000 patients or so, 5,000 to 10,000 patients, right? So what is the role of digital tools, right? And that brought in IBM as well as NCCN to sit together and work with the coalition on the continent. So there's an African Cancer Coalition, which consists of about 13 countries and over 100 cancer practitioners. So everybody came together, and we said then, so there are cancer guidelines that are being used in the US and other places, but you can't just copy and paste them on the continent, because it depends on the availability of drugs, it depends on what kind of radiotherapy machines you have, and so forth. So the coalition actually then said, okay, what if we create new harmonized guidelines which can serve many countries, not just Ethiopia or Kenya or Nigeria, but what if we think at a scale, right? So we created a harmonized cancer guideline, and then said, well, the next step is to digitize it so that oncologists can actually, instead of flipping through hundreds or thousands of pages looking at decision trees, they need a tool that they could use to easily make decisions related to, chemotherapy, radiotherapy, and whatever types of treatments exist. And all of the work that we have done over the last 3-4 years, what it showed us is that there needs to be an alliance, right? A partnership that brings many of these organizations together so that together we can be allied and fight cancer, which is on the rise. And it's interesting because then you have the infectious diseases that already exist, and on top of it now, you have non-communicable diseases such as cancer and diabetes that are also on the rise, and there's comorbidities that's happening. So that's kind of the story of the alliance and why we are here today.
Right.
And,
So how do the oncologists access this tool? Is it like on a smartphone? Or?
Yes, they can access it on smartphone, on tablets, and over the cloud as well, using their desktop as well.
Right. So these kinds of alliances, then, are they something fairly new for the region?
They are fairly new, and it takes quite a lot of kind of effort, to make them happen. I think one big revelation for me was, a lot of people might think technology is like a solution, but it's really, technology by itself is not the end, right? First, you gotta know what kind of problem do you want to solve. You gotta prioritize the problems that you want to solve so that you can have impact, right? Then you also need to think in a very multidisciplinary way. There's no way that a technology company could actually be solving such a problem on its own because we do not have domain expertise, right? So the key in making this, coalition a success was the ability through the American Cancer Society to work with the oncologists on the ground, to bring them together in the same room with government officials from ministries of health, and think about it from different perspectives and have a commonly agreed framework to address the problem.
Right. Okay, so I think when Sheikh Hashama comes back on stage, we're going to talk a little bit more about this problem of bringing together the technology companies with government and so on and creating these alliances. But talk to us a little bit more about what IBM has been doing, some of the other projects. I mean,
yes,
give us a couple.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I lead the IBM Research Africa labs. And by default, the problems that we're addressing are related to sustainability, which was described extremely well in the previous session as well. We're talking about how do we help small-scale farmers, how do we support water management, including city water or even boreholes that exist in the countryside. We're talking about how do we support small and medium enterprises, right? So our role is to think about how these exponential technologies that are being developed could be harnessed in order to solve these problems at scale. So we have hired quite a lot of scientists, engineers from around the world and brought them to the Africa lab so that they can actually think about this, these problems. What we found interesting in our journey is, though because of our context, we focused on sustainability. Sustainability is actually the biggest problem we should be focusing on at the moment. It's a global problem. If you look at the fact that there's 2 billion people that are exposed with food insecurity. There's about 8 to 10 million people that are dying from air pollution. Biodiversity was mentioned before, right? So the fact that we're losing some of the species, about 1 million or so in the next 10 years is a big problem. We have, 1 in 4 people in the world are going to be living in countries that are water insecure, right? Or because of climate change. So we got to think about how AI, blockchain, and Internet of Things and those type of technologies, including quantum, could actually help us develop technologies that can scale, that can attack the problem at scale, not just siloed projects and pilots. We got to move away from that mentality now. We have done it for the last 10 years. Now it's about how do we scale these pilots so that they can impact tens of millions of people.
Right. So, all right. So that is the question. How do you scale? I mean, Sheikh Hashama gave some examples of, circular economy technology projects. And some of the projects that IBM has been working on in Africa include, as you said, monitoring the condition of water boreholes or creating microfinance schemes for small business people, or there's your project Hello Tractor, which is kind of like an Uber for tractors. So farmers can order a tractor to help them with the harvest. So how do you get any of those things from being a small local project to a large-scale thing?
Yeah, so I think at the root of it is really the partnership. We got to have the right type of partnerships, right? For example, as you mentioned, right, we have done work with Hello Tractor, which is a company, more or less that's Uber for tractors, right? So the biggest problem in Africa when it comes to small-scale farming is mechanization. Farmers don't have access to tractors. So how about, if there is a tractor owner that has a tractor, how about developing an app that can be used to share that tractor among, hundreds of farmers, right? So, from our side, we went and said, okay, let's partner with them. We started with a small partnership, but when we showcase the value of the partnerships and how the data coming from the tractors is actually extremely important for the banks, and when we showed that it's important for the seed companies, fertilizer companies, and the financiers and so forth, all of a sudden, we saw that this partnership is growing, right? So that kind of trusted partnership and an understanding that there's significant value to be created through that partnership, and it's not just one company or one partner taking all of the gains. That shift in mindset is going to be important. The other one also that we have realized through this partnership is about data, the ability and importance of sharing data on a common platform. Now that is a very sensitive topic, and we have talked about it in the past. So what we have done in the last 5 years or so is actually think about publicly available data in the first place, which is not being mined at all. There is data, for example, in the healthcare space that goes all the way to districts, right? 5-year, 10-year-old data. However, nobody is doing anything with it to understand, maternal, child, or newborn health kind of, insights, to derive those insights, or to think about, cause and effect, right? So that is not being done. So, right, again, creating the right partnerships to say, we're going to mine this data and showcase that there is value in terms of decision-making is also becoming extremely more important.
And so why is the data not being used up till now? Is it stored in inaccessible formats? Is it behind, barriers of other kinds? Or is there just has nobody sat down to try to aggregate it?
So I think, again, it's a mind shift that's needed, right? So there is data that's sitting behind firewall, but there's also publicly available data. But I think that data is being used to make some very, very minor decisions, and nobody is actually sitting and thinking about, can we develop scalable tools that could be used by decision makers or district officers to actually help them enhance their decisions? So, again, you see small pilots, but not a big movement, open source movement that says, okay, we're going to figure out and develop some tools that we're going to allow anyone to utilize, right? So we're just seeing that shift happening. On the other side of it, of course, there's a lot of data that's, consumer data, for example, that a lot of, companies have. And they haven't had the comfort of sharing that data so far because they haven't seen the impact that this type of, insights could have, right?
Can you give a concrete example of what might be?
For example, right, understanding, consumer behavior data from small, shops across the continent. There's over 200 million small shops across Africa, right? Understanding that consumer behavior, what kind of products, healthcare products they buy, or the patterns of purchase when it comes to food, right? That could actually give you a lot of insight when it comes to nutrition, all the way across the supply chain, right? So having that data supplement the publicly available data could actually play a significant role in terms of, resource mobilization. How should governments, focus when they deploy their, budgets? Which regions should they prioritize? And even for funders, right? Be it, the World Bank, IMF, and private organizations, how they should be deploying their resources is going to be impacted by that.
Right. So what are the biggest obstacles, do you think, in Africa to creating more of these sorts of partnerships and also more of that data sharing?
So, from our side, I think one realization is tech is a big part of it, but it's somewhat difficult for technology companies by themselves to actually bring everyone together, right? So to create that trusted partnership, you need people from, organizations like the American Cancer Society, who have in-depth understanding of the space, the domain expertise, right? So there needs to be that mix in order for us to have this, scalable partnerships.
Right. Okay. We spoke at one of our EmTech conferences earlier in the year, and you said at the time that by 2050 you thought a lot more innovations could be coming from Africa rather than being imported. Yeah. What do you think those might be? Which areas might they be in? Yeah,
I'm very optimistic, especially, again, specifically in the context of sustainability. When it comes to, new ways of, innovations in agriculture, when it comes to innovations related to water management, right? Mm-hmm. When it comes to innovations related to new types of fertilizers or, management in that space, I think a lot could come from the continent. Because there's a lot of problems that are being solved at the moment, right? Mm-hmm. So that's one side of it. The problems themselves are not just African problems, but these are problems. Food security is not just secluded to one continent. It's a global kind of problem, right? And also what we are realizing is when we're solving these problems in the short term by developing these tools, we're getting a lot of interesting scientific insight as well, mm-hmm. right? When you look at, for example, the genetic diversity of the continent, and you combine it with these different, trajectories that we're seeing in terms of be it cancer or be it diabetes and so forth, plus on top of that infectious diseases, at that intersection, we're seeing that there's a lot of science to be done. Just to give you an example, right? There are some regions on the continent where people are actually resistant to malaria, right? Mm-hmm. On the other side of it, on the flip side of it, they're actually more susceptible to breast cancer. Now you go and start to understand what kind of genetic factors are involved in this, right? So what does it mean for cancer metastasis? What is the pathways and so forth, right? So if you're not in that context, it would be very difficult to actually work on those type of problems. So I feel that scientific discoveries there could have, significant impact, later on. Going back to the water example, for example, the water management system that we developed mm-hmm. for, the arid, semi-arid northern part of Kenya, it turns out has significant applications to California, where mm-hmm. there's similar problems when it comes to drought and severe weather pattern changes. Right?
I think you were doing a pilot project this year. How did the pilot go?
It's about forming the partnerships. Like you say, there's roadblocks and partnerships, but we're getting over those roadblocks.
Yes, California could use some help, I think. And another question that kind of relates to some things we've talked about in the past is, so everywhere in the world wants to be a tech hub. And it seems like there's a certain kind of critical mass effect that happens where funding and entrepreneurs and universities come together in an ecosystem, and there can only be so many of those ecosystems. Yeah. Yeah. So how do African countries or Middle Eastern countries or anywhere that has not traditionally had those hubs, how do they create enough critical mass to have something going on?
Yeah, so that's also a work in progress. I think the most critical part of that, first of all, would be skills, right? You need to have, universities that have the right curriculums, that have the right kind of environment to enable students to be successful. So I'm seeing a trend across Africa, be it in Nigeria, Kenya, or Southern Africa, that the universities are actually crafting and adapting their curriculum and making it extremely agile. It's not necessarily a 4 or 5 year university degree, but you also have the option of taking a 3-week or a 3-month or 6-month kind of course so that you can focus on machine learning or deep learning or sensor networks or whatever you want to do, right? So I think that trajectory is increasing. But to your point, I mean, you can't have 54 countries that are going to have their own tech hub. It's important to figure out, for example, if you go to East Africa, if the strength of the university system is agronomy, why not focus on that as a domain and then embed technology into it, right? So we got to understand, how do you have these hubs, healthcare hubs, agriculture hubs, water resources hubs, and so forth. But related to that, for example, is another announcement that we made in terms of quantum, access to the quantum computing, right? So our goal there is not necessarily for Africa to create its own quantum computing. It's about quantum is here, it's coming, right? So there's a lot of companies working on it, and the technology is maturing. However, the way you program a quantum computer is going to be extremely different from how you program the current computer systems. So it is important that we develop skills locally, right? So what we have done is created a partnership with one of the universities in South Africa. Interestingly, that university has access to 15 more universities across the continent, and that's what creates a network effect, right? So now all of a sudden you have all these universities and countries that are networked, accessing quantum computer over the cloud and utilizing it to develop skills. And that, all of a sudden, is now starting to attract local companies to think about what use cases could be useful to solve on this computer.
Right. Excellent. Yeah. We're out of time for this session, but thank you very much, Solomon.
Thank you. Thank you.
So.